Good morning, everyone. It is a very distinct honor and pleasure for me to be here for many, many reasons. This is actually the second time I've been in Dubai, and first time was more about sightseeing. This time was more about the people and really understanding what it is to live here in Dubai, to live in the UAE. And for me, it's been such an honor to come to this very deeper, meaningful level. Number one, it's an honor to be amongst you, to see all the energy and the faces of what the future will mean for government, whether it's through technology, through education, through design, through healthcare, whatever that might be. It's so invigorating to see what will happen in the not so distant future. I'm also honored because I'm here in Dubai, here in the UAE, where His Highness the Prime Minister actually has said the aim of the nation is to build hope, life, the future, and to make people happy. How many governments or leaders of the nation are open and willing and committed to say something as bold as that? And I'm also honored to be here and very, very privileged to be living in this time and in space, time and place in the whole world, where happiness really matters. It's no longer a nice to have, because now we have the United Nations, the Harvard Business Review, The Economist, clearly stating and showing the stats behind why happiness matters because of its economic value. And we know why happiness matters. It's not because it's about smiles or, excuse me, not just about smiles or rainbows or unicorns or things like that. It's about us as individuals. Us as individuals living up to our real, authentic selves and living by our values every day and living with a higher purpose in our lives. And so for me, coming back to my own experience in the corporate world, whether it's a startup or a Fortune 500, we now know that it comes back down to happier employees equal happier customers, equals more successful, profitable, sustainable businesses, but more importantly, more meaningful lives. And that equation, of course, is analogous to what happens in governments. So happier governments, or the people behind government, equals happier citizens, equals happier cities, sustainable cities, and again, more importantly, meaningful lives. So what does this all mean? Because in the end, it's not easy. It's not easy being committed to happiness, but it's happening now. And we're at the time and place where we're making that change. And as I see the people in the room, I realize as I go across the world talking about this, there is change happening every day. I'd like to take a poll first. How many people in the room actually know this company called Zappos.com? Raise of hands. Zappos.com? Okay, thank you. Is everyone hearing me okay? No? Can we turn it up a little? No? I'll do it the manual way. How about this? It's better? Okay. And I will try to speak louder. Thank you. So Zappos.com, how many people have heard about Zappos.com? Okay, awesome. And then how many people have heard about delivering happiness? It first was a book. It's actually published here as well. Okay, great, thank you. And then how many people in the room feel that you personally know how to predict your own personal, long-term, sustainable happiness in your own life? Raise of hands. Okay, great, thank you. It's so interesting because for me, I ask that question all over the world. And these days, no matter what country I'm in, I ask that same question, and it never fails. Only 1% to 5% of the room raises their hand. Actually, I was in Beijing about 8 months ago, and I can officially say only 0% to 5% of the room raises their hand. And I can only say that because I'm Chinese. But it's astounding to me, because you think about it, why is that the case? As a global society, here we are living pretty lucky. Advanced in technology, socioeconomically, all these things that have been sacrificed for us in the past, we now benefit from. Yet we as a global society are still fundamentally unhappy. Why does this have to be the case? It's not a new concept at all. There's a guy by the name of Aristotle back in 200 AD. He actually said that happiness is the purpose of our existence, but more importantly, happiness is dependent on ourselves. So what does that all mean? How can we reflect on this state of what we can use happiness for? Not just the state of saying it's cool to be happy, but actually making it so that we all have citizens of the world more productive, more engaged, more themselves, and actually creating a greater global society. So of course, I wanted to bring up some real world examples. If you look on the top right over there, we've got Renee. She just received her financial statement from Merrill Lynch. She had thought that if she had saved for her retirement fund, she'd be a happy girl, but unfortunately this is not the case. We've got Stella on the bottom right hand. She's just unhappy because her mom won't upgrade her phone. But seriously though, I want to bring it to this question, to everyone in the room. What is your own personal goal in your life? And if you ask this question, what's interesting is that no matter who you ask and how you answer it, I want to have a healthy family, I want to buy a home, I want to have a successful career. If you ask yourself why enough times, it goes back to the same reason. I just want to be happy. Or I just want to make sure the people in my life that I love and care about are happy as well. But what's ironic is that when we talk about happiness, and I want to caveat, when we talk about happiness, I talk about the science of happiness. What Dan Gilbert talks about in positive psychology. So this is real raw data and research being done on focusing on what's right with us and how we can increase that happiness, not focusing so much on what's wrong with us. So we always hear, going back to the science, that we as humans are physiologically hardwired to seek happiness, yet we are really bad at predicting it. Hence the 0 to 5% of people raising their hands. And we hear it from what Dan Gilbert's research said. They looked at lottery winners and they said, oh yeah, of course they'll be happy now, but now we know the truth. Lottery winners, their happiness levels stay the same or actually peters down over time. And we also know that the inverse is true. The people that have lost their sight or use of their limbs, their happiness levels stay the same or actually increase over time. And we hear it all around us, whether it's in our heads, in our communities. Oh yeah, when I get this, I'll be happy. When I achieve this or get this raise, whatever, I'll be happy. But then you never actually get there. Why is it an unending cycle? So if you think about it, and I started reflecting on my own life because I find it so ironic that I talk about happiness everywhere I go. That I'm so passionate about this subject matter because I was not that happy-go-lucky person at all when I was growing up in school. I was the one in the back of the room listening to the Walkman, to songs by The Cure, Depeche Mode, I don't know if you know them. I was reading all these books, existential books like The Stranger by Albert Camus, reading it in French, so you can't get much more gloomier than that, right? And I was thinking to myself, like, what is this all for? Why even bother to do this to begin with? So I started reflecting and I went back to my own childhood. And so for me, I'm Asian American. My parents were born in Hong Kong. And so for whatever reason in that household, I grew up thinking there was 3 essential things to be successful in life. Number 1 was get into a good school. Number 2 was become a doctor or a lawyer. And number 3 was learn a variety of musical instruments. And so for me, I thought it was successful. I was going to school at UC Berkeley in California. I was studying pre-med, and I had several years of piano under my belt. But when I started studying it, I realized, this is not me. So I started wandering, and I stumbled upon something called Asian American Studies. It's an actual major at UC Berkeley. And I was just so impassioned by this topic, because all of a sudden I learned all these things about not only myself, but about my ancestors and what they did to help build what the US is today. So I got so excited, I decided to major in it, and I picked up the phone to call my parents, and you can probably predict the next scene, right? They completely freaked out. They said, "Are you serious? Why don't you just come home more often and we'll tell you what your Asian American life is about?" We are working all these jobs for you and your brothers to give you opportunities we never had or could imagine. Your great-great-great-grandparents sailed the Pacific Ocean in a tiny little boat and almost died so that now you can tell us you're going to study yourself. And I said, wow, they're really good at this guilt thing. But I stood my ground and I said, you know what, I'm going to do it. It's the first time I felt so passionate about something. And so I majored in it, and I remember that moment distinctly. I graduated, I was alone in my apartment, it was deathly quiet, and I realized what my parents meant. I couldn't find a job. So it was my turn to freak out, and I just started cold calling every single company I knew, and luckily for me, it was really about timing. I was in Silicon Valley. The .com was born. The internet was born. I became an internet consultant at KPMG just like that. And you guys know the story, right? The money, title, status just fell into my lap, literally overnight. And you know the end of that story. The .com busted, and the money, title, status was gone, just like that. I got laid off. And I felt like a total loser. And it wasn't because so much that I lost the money, title, status. I felt like a loser. It was because I thought that was everything, when it meant little or nothing at all. So that's when I realized what I was doing. I was running away from a question that I didn't never want to answer, which was, what would I do if I did not have the fear of failure? So that's when, if you're familiar with the story of Zappos, that's when I decided to do something so completely different. I decided to climb a mountain, Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. And so I called up my friend Tony, he's the CEO of Zappos, and so basically I said, hey, do you want to join me? He said, yeah, sure, let's do this. So you can imagine us, here we are in our 20s, climbing this mountain. I just got laid off from my job. Tony just sold his first company to Microsoft for about $280 million. Clearly, we were at the opposite ends of the financial spectrum, right? But what was interesting, and we didn't realize till we started working on this book together, was that we were asking the same exact question, which was, what would we do for the rest of our lives if money didn't matter? So we summited, it was just straight like out of a movie. Beautiful sunrise. We both were feeling, wow, this is incredible. Maybe anything can be possible. So at that point, we go back to our normal lives, and Tony goes back to Zappos. He actually invests his own money into Zappos, and the rest is history. I'll share with you later. And then for me, I come back to that moment. And it happens to everyone in this room, if not once, many times in your lives. It's that moment when you feel like the rug gets pulled up from under your feet, your life does a 180. And for me, it was facing my greatest fear. And my greatest fear was losing someone in my life that I couldn't imagine life without. And that's when I lost my dad to colon cancer. And that moment, it really pushed me to really think about, what is this really all for? And so I just started looking at life at that point like a green field. I started doing things that I was super passionate about. I started writing, I started doing graphic design, I started making films, just things that were of substance to me. And through that process, inadvertently, I actually realized my own values. If it wasn't the money, title, status, what was it? I realized it was the people in my life. And I knew if I made decisions based on that, I would never look back with regret. And in some weird parallel way, that's when I stumbled upon this tiny little company named Zappos.com. And when I first met it, all it wanted to do was sell the most shoes in the world. But then it grew up and said, you know what, we're going to focus and be the best at customer service. And then it grew up again and says, you know what, we're going to focus on employee happiness as #1 priority. And through that process, they realized their own values and their own higher purpose, which essentially is to deliver happiness to the world. So I'm going to take a real quick pause on this particular slide because some of you might be thinking why I did this in a particularly funky way. And we have this thing we do with our clients. It's called the happiness heartbeat exercises. And this actually applies not just to individuals, but for companies. And what we do is very simply just plot the highs and lows of your life or your company's life. Because we believe that happiness doesn't come from just the highs. Happiness, sustainable happiness, actually comes from also understanding the lows. If you look at those moments, what values were present or absent? What people were present or absent in your life or in your company? And actually starts mapping out the very first question that I asked, that question being, how do you sustain happiness in your life or in your company? So at this point in the presentation, oftentimes companies say, yeah, happiness is a business model. That sounds all great for you, but you don't know where I work or live. Tell me about something else that would make more sense. So of course, for me, I go back to my case study. This is Zappos. Zappos.com is headquartered in Las Vegas. This is actually a picture of Zappos in Nevada. And believe it or not, there's not a rainbow over it every day. But when I think of Zappos, I think of this quote by Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And I put this up there not only because I love it as a personal mantra, but I put it up there because the company that just happens to be called Zappos actually uses this for day-to-day business decisions. This is a picture of their warehouse in Kentucky. Some might call it a woman's dream closet. This is full of shoes. Others might call it a man's ultimate nightmare. I don't know. But I put this up there because there's been so much time, money, resources to make this one of the most advanced warehouses in the world. But the reason why they did this is not to say, hey, look at us, we've got amazing technology. The reason why they did this internally was to create PEC, personal emotional connection with every single customer they touch. So that if there was a customer, let's say in New York, they would order a pair of shoes, put their kids to bed, the next morning before they jump into the taxi to go to work, there would be a box of shoes at their doorstep. To create that wow factor, to create that PEC with every single customer that they touch. Something else that they've been testing out, which has been pretty cool, is that they have now the ability to sense where a customer is calling in from, let's say from San Francisco, and then they'll actually take that call and connect it to a customer service rep that has lived in San Francisco or was born in San Francisco, so that they can have this meaningful conversation about this PEC, about, oh yeah, what about that hot dog joint on the corner, is it still there, etc. But what's interesting is that even though customer service is what Zappos is known for, being the best at basically changing all the rules of what it means to be a retailer, internet retailer at first, but now just a retailer in general. But what's interesting is that customer service is not their #1 priority. Their #1 priority comes back to company culture. So that the whole thought is that if you get company culture right, if you have your happiest employees, everything else like great customer service, having very productive and engaged employees actually comes more naturally. And what's great about this is that it wasn't just Zappos that was doing it. Along this whole time in parallel, there were people and professionals and experts in the business industry trying to figure out what separates companies, what separates those that can withstand the economic ups and downs of time. And what they found was very unconventional. They found that these two things, having a very strong company culture and having a higher purpose so that employees can be inspired by, that's what separates the companies from survival to sustainability. So how do you make something like culture so fluffy a priority? So one of the things that Zappos does is they have every trainee goes through 5 weeks of training. And throughout that whole time, there's a standing offer of $4,000 to quit, anytime. No questions asked. If you want to leave, here's your check. Thank you very much. Nothing personal. And the reason why they do that is they really want people, every candidate, to really embody and respect what culture means, what the values are at Zappos. And if you think about it, it actually saves money for Zappos in the long run, because on average, for every bad hire that you have, it costs every company about 150 to 300% of that person's salary to be able to go through the process of firing that person, hiring a new one, and going through that all over again with training. So if you think about it calculation-wise, it does make sense that it saves Zappos and companies money if you have this $4,000 offer to quit. Another thing that we talk about and do at Zappos is the Zappos Culture Book. So this is a really interesting experiment because it just started when we developed our values, and that was over 10 years ago. And so we asked ourselves, how do you actually define culture? So we said, you know what, why don't we ask our employees? So we asked them, every one of them, to say, submit 2 to 3 paragraphs of what you think Zappos culture means to you. And so what we did was we published it completely unedited in a book. Unedited meaning the good stuff was in there, but also the bad stuff was in there. And it was interesting because once we started doing it every year, we began to see the sort of trends, whether or not the culture was scaling over time as the company grew, or if it got worse over time. And luckily, I think for Zappos, because they're so committed to culture, it actually improved over time. And now that we send this book to anywhere in the world, anyone that asks for it, it's very interesting because even though Zappos doesn't send anything, doesn't send shoes out of the US, they have raving fans in Japan or Brazil just because they believe so strongly about what Zappos stands for in their purpose. So if anyone's interested in taking a look at this culture book, we'd be happy to send a copy to you as well. Just shoot me an email. I'll have this at the end of the presentation as well, but my email is just jen@deliveringhappiness.com. So going back to DNA of values, what I call the DNA of a company, what does it all mean? I thought I was just so astounded when I was a KPMG consultant. You'd have all these fancy plaques in the boardroom or in the lunchroom saying, these are our values, this is our mission statement. But when you start asking around people, hey, do you know your values? Some of them, or actually most of them would sort of shake their heads and say, no, I don't really know them at all. But at Zappos, in delivering happiness, every single employee knows their values by heart. This is 10 of their values, of Zappos' values. I won't name every single one of them, but I'll just name a couple. Number 10 is be humble. And the way they test for that is that they have a Zappos shuttle driver that picks up the candidate, brings them to Zappos, does the whole interview process, drops them off to wherever they want to go. After that, the recruiter actually comes out and talks to the shuttle driver and the person at the front desk just to ask, were you treated with respect? And if the answer was no, it doesn't matter how well that person interviewed, they're not going to be a culture fit and it's a no hire. Number 3 is another one I like, is create fun and a little weirdness. And this is actually an interview question that they have. On a scale of 1 to 10, how weird are you? And I like asking that question in live audiences because those people that are smiling ear to ear, you're probably at the 8, 9, 10 end of that scale. 20? Okay, you're 20. That's where I am as well. But the point of that is not to get a number. The point is, what's the reaction? Are you going to feel okay being your weird, authentic self at work? And more importantly, are you going to be okay that other people are going to be their true selves at work as well? So I just talk about Zappos as just one single company, as one example that happened to focus on company culture and customer service to become the $2 billion company it is today in gross merchandise sales. And as some of you know, they were acquired by Amazon.com a few years ago now for about $1.2 billion at the time of closing. But what's great is that it's not just Zappos. This is a chart by the Fortune 100 Best Workplaces in the US that shows in the last 10 years, for those companies that actually focused on well-being and company culture, they outperformed the S&P 500, the more traditional way of looking, how do you run a company? So this is in the last 10 years, and we all know how economically stifling and difficult and tumultuous it's been. But for those that double down and bet on people, they actually outperform financially. Yet, this is still the case. We are having this still all around the world. Why? What is it that can we do to change that? There's a poll by Gallup in 2012 that showed that in the entire world, 87% of the workforce feel disengaged or unhappy with their work. And just in the US alone, that's $500 billion lost in productivity. So, what are the lessons learned of why and how we can make happiness a model, not just in businesses, but in everyday life and communities and cities as well? So these are some of the lessons learned that we learned at Zappos. Number 1 was commitment. How committed are you to this idea of a values-driven organization or community? Because we know what culture isn't anymore. After the Silicon Valley, all the dot-com bust, we know that culture isn't having free drinks in the refrigerator and having a ping pong table in the rec room. It's something so much more dynamic and complex than that. So when times get tough, how committed are we in the idea that it's the values that matter first, it's the people that matter first in order to change that around? The second thing is defining core values, or if you already have them, revisiting core values. Because as I said earlier, there's so many companies and communities out there that say they have their values, but how are you actually living by them? One very simple question that we ask our clients is that, what are your own personal core values? And then compare that to your company's or your community's core values. Do they align? And if they don't, it's a very fundamental question, are you in the right place? One of the things that we talk about is to do it really early and do it very committedly, because it is so hard. It took Zappos at Delivering Happiness a full year to get to the core values that we have today. And this is examples of our core values. So number 9, I'll just name one of them. Number 9 is be creative. So be like MacGyver and Bruce Lee. So MacGyver is like be resourceful, do more with less, be creative. And Bruce Lee is be fluid like water. And I named this particular value because I'm pretty sure no other company in the world has this value. And I'm pretty sure no employee ever in Delivering Happiness will ever forget this value. And the point being is that whatever values you have as a company or a community, make sure that they were real and they're genuine to you. You can have words like integrity and trust, and these are really big, important words, but how do they mean, and what does it mean to you in an everyday life? And how can you make it customized to that? Number 3 is commitment to transparency. And this is very simple, it's just being real, being true. And this can happen at the company level, community level, and the employee level. So to take examples of the employee level, what we encourage is for people to be true to themselves. And we talk about not just work-life balance, because that never really works. We talk about work-life integration. We spend over half of our waking hours, most of us, at work. Why do they need to be separate? So we think about it in a way of, if you can encourage workplaces and communities so that they can have people bring their passions to work. So what we see all the time is that our clients, they have people saying, oh yeah, I'm so passionate. Let's say there's someone in, let's say, customer service or the legal department that's really passionate about surfing or gardening or cooking, whatever that might be. And if you encourage environments for people to bring their passions, then you'll have these water cooler conversations where you'll see someone saying, oh yeah, you're going camping this weekend? I'd love to bring my family. I'd love to go with you. And so what happens is they have this meaningful experience outside of the workplace. What's more interesting is that they bring that meaningful experience back come Monday, and they're much more engaged with their work, they're much more engaged with each other, and they're much more productive and therefore more successful for the company in the end. So it pays off to be able to encourage this idea of being true to yourself with work-life integration. The fourth thing we learned is this idea of vision, purpose. Simon Sinek has a great TED Talk and now a book, Start With Your Why, and it's just as simple as that. Why are you doing what we do on a day-to-day basis? So for employees, what we say is, what are you inspired by? What is your vision that's beyond profits or just making money? There's this great little story about these 3 bricklayers. So they're all doing the same thing, they're just laying bricks, and yet they're all at different happiness levels. And if you ask the unhappiest guy, hey, what are you doing? He says, oh, I'm laying bricks. And then you ask the moderately happy guy, and he says, oh, I'm building a house. But you ask the happiest guy, and he said, yes, I'm building a cathedral. And so, in essence, they're all doing the same exact activity, but because they have a different vision in their head, they have a different purpose, they view that activity so differently because it's aligned or not aligned with what their own purpose is in their own life. So that's on the employee levels. And the entrepreneur level, we've always had so many questions. How do we make another successful Zappos story? And what we say is that, what if you were to do something for 10 years and never make a dime, but be okay with it? Because you are so passionate and so aligned with that purpose. Because as we all know, as entrepreneurs, when we're at the bottom of the well, looking up, wondering how we're going to get out of that spot or predicament, it's going to be back to that why, that purpose as to why we did it in the first place that will help us get out of that well. So number 5 is build meaningful relationships. And this one's a huge one in terms of sustainable happiness. Think about the concept of PEC that I introduced earlier. What if you do that with not just customers? What if you build those PECs with every single person you touch in your ecosystem? Be it your colleagues, your coworkers, your partners, your vendors, everyone in your community. How would life be different if you were to try and wow every single person you touch in that? I'll think about this idea of how we live in this society is that we no longer have to live in a zero-sum game. We can all come to the table with what we bring to the value, that value of our value individually, and we can all walk away from that table with everyone benefiting that much more from what we brought to it. I'll just pull one of the quotes from the book real quick that demonstrates this. Does anyone know who said this? If the person you're talking to isn't listening, be patient. Maybe he has a small piece of fluff in his ear. Anyone? Probably one of the more profound thinkers of our time. No? That was Winnie the Pooh. All right, number 6, and this is the last one, but such an important one in what we learned in committing to what a happy, values-driven organization is building the right team. And everyone knows it sounds so simple, but how challenging it could be. And so what we learned the hard way is that what we should have done is hire slow and fire quick. And I know that sounds sort of harsh for a people-driven organization, but we all know actually, that it just takes that one person to change the whole dynamic of the team, the department, the company, or community, just that one person that could change everyone else's experience, whether it's from an emotional level or the experience of what they do at a day-to-day job. Another thing we say is hire fire based on values. And so, as an example of this, even if you have someone that's doing a rock star, amazing job at, let's say, selling or whatever they're doing in their performance, if they're not living up to their values, that's actually reason for firing. So that in the end of the day, if you're not contributing to the values, if you're not living by those values, that you're not in the right place, even though you might be performing amazingly well. There was a great little article in a Wired magazine. It was about 8 months ago, and it was talking about the way that wildlife moves, their movement in nature. And so they first looked at bees, and they saw that, you can imagine bees making honey. And they're all chaotic, butting heads, but they're getting their job done, they're making their honey. Then they looked at sea mackerel. So the mackerel, they noticed they swim faster and faster when they felt threatened. And again, they're getting their job done, they're protecting themselves, but again, they're not really getting anywhere. But then they looked at birds. So if you can imagine birds, flying over the, let's say, Serengeti, and so they're all flying in one direction. But when one bird changes direction, the whole flock flies with it. Same thing with another random bird, changes direction, the whole flock flies with it as well. So what's interesting is there in that example is that every single bird is acting as its own animal, but together, collectively, they're acting as if they're one single organism. So back to the study, what was very interesting, what they found that the movement, the algorithm of the movement of all these species of animals are exactly the same, except for one variable. And that variable is what they called alignment. So what they found was the bees were the least, or not aligned at all, but the birds were the most aligned. So if you think about it and apply that to an organizational setting or a community, so you think about if you can have a DNA that binds all these different animals, the values, if you can have that bound, then every single individual can act like their true, authentic self, can make their own decisions, can feel empowered that they have the trust amongst everyone else in the organization that they will do their job according to the values. And with everyone doing that, they together are essentially one organism flying towards the same exact goal that everyone else wants to achieve and believe in. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the science of happiness. And so these are some of the things that we learned along the way. First, to talk about a memoir. It was written by this woman. She worked in palliative care, so basically hospices for many years. And so she basically spent a lot of time with people right before they passed away. And what she noticed that there was a consistency of what they said before they did, their I wishes in life. One of their I wishes was, I wish I let myself be happier. Another I wish was, I wish I spent more time with my friends and family more. But the number one I wish that she noticed was that I wish that I lived true to myself and not what others expected of me. And I thought that was so interesting because no longer do we have to be at that time and period and look back and say, I wish. We can actually look back and say, wow, I'm so glad I did. Because the studies go back to show it's not the things that we did in life that we tend to regret. It's actually the things that we didn't do in life, that we didn't try, that we look back with regret. So I don't know about you, like for me, when it comes to that day, there was actually a really great article by Ariana Huffington, who is the editor of HuffPost. And she basically said, this is the title, says it all. It's, are you working for your resume, or are you working for your eulogy? And I know that kind of sounds morbid, but really, what do we do on a day-to-day basis? Are we trying to get up that ladder, or are we trying to do something of more meaning in our lives? And so for me, I don't know about you, I'll take it my own example. When it comes that day for me, my best friend comes to the podium, I would hope she has something to say other than, oh yeah, that Jen, oh yeah, she made some pretty cool PowerPoint slides. And yeah, that Jen, she was probably the quickest email responder I ever knew. Hopefully by that time, she'll have better things to say. So that brings us to the science of it. What can we do in our workplaces and everyday life to increase our happiness level? So number one is sense of control. How can we feel that we are individually empowered to make our decisions and actually being able to execute upon them? As an example, one of the things we talk about is expectation management, because we want to talk about rational optimism, not irrational optimism. So we're not saying, hey, be happy-go-lucky and everything will be fine, you'll be a successful person. We're saying, be happy, be positive, but be rooted by reality. So as an example, someone that doesn't have rational optimism is, let's say, like a taxi cab driver or a pilot of a plane. If he says, oh yeah, I don't wear my seatbelt every day because I'm a lucky guy. That is not an example of rational optimism. It has to be rooted in something real. So that's a sense of control. How can we choose to look at our lives from a positive or negative outlook? So we go down to the sense of progress. And this essentially is about learning, developing, growing. Are we doing this on a day-to-day basis? So an example what Zappos did in the workplace is that instead of a career going from basically an entry level to a buyer position, it usually takes 18 months. So what they did was they divvied it up in thirds. So that every 6 months they say, hey, congratulations, this is what you accomplished, this is what you have left to do. And just in that act alone, They did nothing in pay raises. Just in that act alone, the happiness levels of that department actually increased because they felt that they were getting somewhere, because they felt that they had this sense of progress. This particular principle also reminds me of a movie. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's back in the 80s. Eddie Murphy was in it, Coming to America? Okay. So you remember that movie? It's, basically Eddie Murphy comes to America. He's a prince. He's never worked a day in his life. And he falls in love with the daughter of the McDonald's manager. I think they call it McDowell's in the movie. And I don't know if you remember that one scene, but they go to work, so they finally get a job there. It's Eddie Murphy and his best friend. And they show that there's someone washing the dishes. And he looks up and he says, hey, hey, hey. Looking at Eddie Murphy's eyes, don't look that way. I was once like you too. But then I graduated to the mop station. Then I graduated to the lettuce station, then the meat station, and in 2.5 years, I'll be assistant manager. And you look at their faces, so you pan over, you see the camera pan over, and his best friend is totally disgusted. He's like, oh my God, why am I here? And then you look over at Eddie Murphy, and he totally is bright. His face is lit up. He's so full of pride because he finally knows where he's going. He finally has a goal in his mind, and he has the steps, the progress of how to get there. Never mind the goal of his entire thing is to, get some action from this girl. Never mind, that's not the point of the whole example of it. It really is about how he came to find a purpose in his life, found a goal, and found himself the progress, the steps, on actually how to get there. So connectedness is the third lever, and that's very simple. It's just basically the breadth and depth of your relationships. And the fourth thing is vision and meaning. And this is a big one that I'll talk about on the next slide. So here's another framework that we talked about in delivering happiness is what are the different types of happiness that we have? So number one is pleasure. And this is a very simple one that everyone knows. We all have our pleasures, and that's not a bad thing. It's like, going out and having dinner with friends, buying a pair of shoes, buying a new car. All these things are pleasures, which is fine and necessary. But unfortunately, according to the science, it's not very sustainable. It comes and goes, and it's gone. It's very fleeting, unless, of course, you're a rock star, because it's about chasing the next high. The second type of happiness we talk about is called passion, and it's about flow and engagement. So how do you engage with your coworkers? How do you engage with people in your life? And this concept of flow is actually a psychological term that describes an activity that you do, could be anything, where it feels like minutes have gone by, but actually hours have gone by, because you're so engrossed in whatever that is. So everyone has their own passions, be it painting, be it photography, gardening, whatever that might be. That's your state of flow. So if you increase those activities in your life, you actually increase your happiness levels as well. We see examples of this in athletes. They call it the zone. There was an example of this high school basketball player, and he broke the number of maximum points scored in one single game. And I think it was something crazy, like 130-something points. And when the media was all hovering over him and saying, hey, what were you thinking this whole time? He just looked squarely at the camera and he said, absolutely nothing. It's because he didn't have to think about anything. He was so in a state of flow. And from a technical term, flow is when you have your level of skill matching up to your level of challenge. And where those two things meet, that is your zone and that's your flow. And so what's interesting about this concept is you can apply it in the workplace too. You can create and massage your job responsibilities, your job everydays, your schedule, so that you introduce states of flow, whatever that might be for you. So it could be brainstorming, being more creative, it could be doodling, it could be whatever it is that creates flow, bring it into the workplace so that you can actually feel that state and feel happier over time and be more engaged. So it's a concept that was developed by a Russian gentleman. His name is Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi. And rumor has it he developed this concept because he had to say his name 10 times really fast. But anyway, the last, and this is the big type of happiness that we talk about, it's about purpose, meaning. What is your higher purpose? What are you doing that's bigger than yourself? And going back to the research, this is what is telling us that will sustain that happiness over time. This is essentially that answer to that very first question I posed. So if you think about it, it could be anything that you do that's beyond just for yourself. And this is what I challenge people. When I ask, hey, what's your purpose? And they say to me, oh, I want to be a great dad or mom. I want to be a great brother, sister, husband, wife. And I say, that is awesome. How much more noble can that be? But if I was to challenge you with this, what if you were truly being your authentic self? and living out your states of flow, your passions in life, and truly living out your purpose in that way, what else would you add to your definition of your purpose more than what you already know? And only you know how to add it, and you know what to add, because only you know when you're being true to that authentic self within you. So this is what we learned along the way. All the stuff about the science of happiness became an aha moment, because it's not just about individual happiness. The same principles apply to a business as well. Because we know for people, we all need our pleasures. We all know for businesses, we all need our profits, unless, if there were no profits, there would be no business to talk about. But what we now know is that unless you layer on the passion and the higher purpose, the odds of you sustaining that happiness as an individual or as a company is sustainable success. The odds of those things are actually that much more against you. So if this is what the research is telling us, by having a vision, a purpose, meaning, values in your life, that can actually not only make you more productive and engaged, you're actually more successful with this whole idea that happiness can actually bring you success. It's not the other way around, that success will bring you happiness. So what that might mean for you, for your own values, for your own company's values and higher purpose, and your own communities as well. So I'll shift my last gear here, and I'll talk about the book a little bit, my experience with Tony and the CEO of Zappos, and how Delivering Happiness came to be. This is actually a picture that we took right when we started writing the book. We were really anxious and freaking out because we only had 5 weeks to write the whole book. And so we started doing all these things to try and motivate each other. We had no idea what to do. We started with a lot of caffeine. So we drank a lot of caffeine. And then we shifted over, and then we actually drank a lot of vodka. So we drank a lot of vodka. And then we actually put caffeine beans in vodka, which worked really well the first night, but the next morning was a terrible idea, would not recommend it. But we finally finished the book, and a few weeks later, we submitted to the publisher. And then a few months later, it came up in the bookshelves. And it was a very surreal moment. When we heard about the New York Times bestseller list and Wall Street Journal, it still felt very unreal. And to this date, we actually have been able to publish it in 20 different languages. And all of this didn't seem that, of substance to me until something happened, which was when people started reading it and writing to us and telling us their experiences, sharing their stories. And it wasn't just businesses saying, hey, I want to apply this as well. I want to make happiness a business model in my company. It was everyday people. So like students and teachers, people working in hospitals and government, even moms and dads. One mom wrote to us, thanks for writing this book. I'm going to be the CMP of my household, the chief managing parent. Because I know I'm a good mom, but I want to be a better mom by instilling values in my family and my husband. So when we got the call from the publisher and they asked, hey, what are you guys going to do for your book tour? And we were like, I don't know. It sounds kind of boring going from one store to the other, but what we did know was that we were so inspired by every one of these stories coming in. That's why the theme of the tour was inspire and be inspired. And it actually is one of our values still today, to inspire and be inspired, because at the end of it, people being true to their authentic selves, whether they realize it or not, have that ability to inspire others and get that back in return. So we went cross country. It was about 3.5 months, 23 cities. In every single city, there was about 4 to 5 events that we had to plan for and execute. So in hindsight, it actually felt like we had to plan and execute like 80 weddings over that time. So if you've been married 80 times, you know exactly what that feels like. It was exhausting, but it was such an amazing time because we were on the road talking to people. We actually bought this bus from the Dave Matthews Band. Does anyone know the Dave Matthews Band? Not too popular here? All right, so we got it from them, and then we went on the road, and this is one of our stops. It's at University of Iowa. And we did a Q&A there, and there's one student that raised her hand, and she said, Tony, Jen, can you tell me your story? How did you get to where you are today? And so I told her the story that I told you earlier. I went to UC Berkeley, I dropped out of pre-med, I freaked out my parents. That was the end of that. A week later, I get an email from the same student, and she said, thanks for telling that story. I just dropped my major of pre-med. And I said, whoa, was that supposed to happen? And I was a little freaking out because I thought her parents might chase us down and ask how we brainwashed her child in such short fashion. But that didn't happen. But I tell that story because I realized what we were doing out there. It was not about our story. It was about hearing from others and realizing that people were actually changing, making decisions, small or big, differently because they posed the question, what would I do differently if I did put priority on happiness? If I did believe that it's not success that brings happiness, but actually happiness that will bring me real success. So then this is in Chicago. We met this woman in the middle, Melissa, and we were at this music festival, and she was just dancing her heart out. And so she basically, you know, we just thought she was one of the happiest people in the world. A few hours later, she comes onto the bus, and she was clearly emotional. She had been crying. We said, hey, what's going on? And she said, you guys don't know how timely it is you're here in Chicago because I just lost my sister/best friend. She committed suicide. And again, it's one of those moments of how inspired that she chose to celebrate her sister's life instead of, you know, be sad at home. So I didn't know if I'd ever see her again. A few weeks later, I'm in Southern California in Los Angeles. I get a tap on my shoulder. Lo and behold, who might that be, of course? It's Melissa. And you know what that means, right? We'll be Facebook friends forever. All right, this is Boston Children's Hospital, and we stopped by because the community and the committee there said, we just formed a culture club, but we don't understand why is it our purpose is so clear in our heads. We want to keep kids healthy, yet why are employees so unhappy? So we started talking to them then, well, let's think about this for a second. Let's put aside the doctors and the nurses for one moment. Let's think about who's the most important people in your organization. The frontliners, the people that are basically meeting your customers, your patients first. What if you empower them to be able to create an environment so they feel that they can own that experience because they know exactly the mental state of that patient coming in, that they can change that person's experience from that very beginning. So we had that conversation, then we went on a tour, and we met this girl on the left here, and she had a kidney transplant, but you wouldn't be able to tell because she was just so full of life, telling her stories. And so we're like, whoa, how can we inspire her? So we started telling our stories of the bus tour, et cetera, showing pictures that I've been showing you. And she just got more and more animated. She was just, you know, getting so full of energy. We're like, whoa, what is this girl gonna say? And she said, oh my gosh, that is so cool. I love your iPad. So I guess Steve Jobs gets that inspiration, but that's all right, he deserves it. All right, this is the last story I'll tell about the tour. And basically this is in Arizona. And these kids that we met there's a high school teacher. He wrote us an email saying, hey, we love this book. I want to make it required reading, but we can't afford it. They're one of the poorest high schools in the state. So we sent a bunch of books there, and he said, hey, why don't we surprise them on the tour? So we went over there, we get off the bus, and they turned the tables on us. They totally surprised us. They had this amazing mariachi band. They made this huge spread of food on the table, and they just had so much to give, yet they had so little resource. So we left, and didn't think anything of it. We get an email again from the same teacher, and he said, you know what, we just want to say thanks. You don't have a Spanish translation of Delivering Happiness. We'll do it for you. So he crowdsourced his students and his teachers and administrators and basically translated the whole book, and then he said, gave it over, and he said, no questions asked. We just want to say thanks. A few months later, I get a call from a publisher in Spain. He said, hey, I want to be able to distribute all your books in Spanish. And he said, well, we have a caveat because we actually have a book that's already been translated. So after a few emails back and forth, we finally came to terms so that now the book has been published about 9 months ago now. Every single book sold in every single Spanish territory in the entire world, a part of those proceeds actually go back to these kids in Arizona. And it's one of those feelings that I'll never forget how they had no idea by paying happiness forward to us that they would get it back in spades in some future point in time. So just to wrap up the book tour, first we started as a book, then we did this whole crazy bus tour, now we're going around the world, and it was very simple for us. There was something changing. There was a tipping point that whether it's in government or in community or in corporations or public-private sector, whatever it is, there was this feeling that happiness could actually change the way we live our lives. So that's why we decided to call ourselves a company, and we actually developed this movement around it. Because for us, it makes scientific sense, it makes business sense, and in the end, it makes human sense. If we are at a point in time where we can actually change the world, move the dial on how we live our lives, why wouldn't we do it? So how we do it is we call it one PCC at a time, one person, one company, one community at a time. And so here are some pictures of our community. Those are the kids that translated the book. And there's a gentleman on the right there, he's from Barcelona. If you can see, I don't know if you can make it out there on his arm. That's actually the first known tattoo I've ever seen on a person's body before. I saw that picture and I said, I don't think I would even get a tattoo of Winky. I'm not sure why he did, but hopefully he stays a happy guy because that thing's not going to fade anytime soon. And going to the community, what we're doing in, if you heard of Downtown Project, Las Vegas, downtown Las Vegas, this is a very interesting project. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend you do so. So basically, we're taking these concepts of values and purpose and applying it to a city so that we're looking at a city as if it's a startup. So we're doing community events there. We're also going around companies around the world to help essentially create sustainable culture change using happiness as the model. And what we do is very, very specific to making it measurable, or how I say, sucking the fluff out of happiness, because then even the biggest naysayers of happiness cannot say nay anymore because it just makes financial sense as well. So we're working with all these experts in the field, statisticians, developing tools and surveys to actually measure what it means to be happy and correlate the happiness of your employees with the happiness of your profits, and to show that there are real metrics and ROI to be returned from them. Oh, and if you were actually interested in the survey, it's something that we offer to individuals. If you want to see your own happiness level in your own workplace, I'll be happy to send you a link to that survey. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, it's not just us talking about it. It's Time Magazine, it's Harvard Business Review, it's the UN, showing time and time again, the stats are not lying. It's not only giving us better retention at work, it's giving us more engagement. So that increases in sales and productivity and profitability, because employees are engaged with each other. They want to show up because they want to see their friends at work. They want to show up because they actually want to do their work. And they want to show up, most importantly, because they're aligned with that purpose of whatever your company or community is doing, they're aligned with it in their own personal way. So coming back to the equation, happier employees equals happier customers equals successful, sustainable companies and the creation of more meaningful lives, all at the same time. And again, going back to the stats, it shows 51% less in turnover, 22% higher in profitability, and an average of 7.5 years longer and happier and healthier life. So for us, we've been in a lucky position in the state of the world. We've been working with a lot of different companies, and in fact, half of our companies are outside of the US, which was a very interesting fact for me. And one of the companies that we just heard from, who was one of the top 20 fastest growing e-commerce companies in the US, just let us know that because of our efforts there, because of our culture efforts, they were able to increase their monthly sales by 39% and decrease their unplanned absences by 92%. And that was just over a few months of work with them. So this is our framework. Basically, we know that profits need to exist, but on top of that, we build a culture of strong values and behaviors that people will live by, using the science of happiness, of connectedness, of progress and control, and ultimately having that science and having that sense of purpose, capping it all on top. And how this goes about it, when we talk it from a people level, it goes from me to the we to the community. Me as the individual, it all starts with us. We have that choice whether or not we're going to make this a positive space or a negative one. Then that cascades to the we, be it our team, be it our department, be it our community. And that's the last cascade, because that will, in effect, change the way that we interact from a larger, greater scale. So what we say is, it's going back to this great quote by a poet, Persian poet, his name is Rumi, as you might know. What he said was that when I was clever, I wanted to change the world. But when I got wiser, I knew I needed to change myself first. So that's why we say at Delivering Happiness, change your world. Everyone in the world has some part of them that wants to affect change in the world somehow. What we say is if you change your world, then together we'll actually be able to change the world. So before I sum it all up, I just want to again offer my email address. If you wanted a copy of the presentation or a copy of the culture book, a link to the survey that I mentioned earlier, or just any questions that you have, that's what we're here for. And again, it's just Jenn@deliveringhappiness.com, and that's Jenn with 2 N's. So just to wrap everything up, just imagine for one moment, if you could imagine if we were all living true to our real, authentic selves. And then if we could imagine if we were all living on a day-to-day basis, living by our passions, our values, and our purpose. And then imagine if you were to actually prioritize happiness, sustainable happiness in our lives. Once you imagine that, then I ask for one more thing to do. And it sounds so simple, right? But if it was a simple thing, then we would have happy people and happy companies all over the world, but we know this is not the case. Because in the last few years, I especially believe, from what I've seen, I think everyone in the world actually has this power and ability to create change, create more change, actually, in the world than we ever thought possible. And who knew? It would come back to that simple little thing that we all knew about, that simple little thing called happiness. So I sincerely, again, thank you for everyone's time. I honor you being here, and I'd love to hear from you if you have your own stories to tell. Thank you.